Earth's ecosystems have evolved for millions of years, resulting in diverse and complex biological communities living in balance with their environment. Since the 16th century, human activity has impacted nature in practically every part of the world. Wild plants and animals are at the risk of extinction. Deforestation and land degradation are causing water scarcity and erosion, and climate change leads to acidification of oceans. Over the past 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly than ever before. 60% of ecosystems are degraded and often overexploited, and pressure on nature are increasing despite the growing number of responses to tackle biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss is the extinction of species, both flora and fauna, worldwide, and also the local reduction or loss of species in a certain habitat. When a species is no longer found in a region, it is locally extinct. But when it is no longer found anywhere, the species is considered extinct. Extinction is a natural event and from a geological perspective, routine. In last century, human impact has been so severe that thousands of species and varieties are becoming extinct annually. Let's discuss some of the main causes of extinction of biodiversity in this video. Nature and its contributions to people are fundamental to the existence of humans as a species and for our societies and their future development. Nature and its contribution to people are, however, continuing to decline, largely because of human actions. Of the 2,493 species assessed in Europe and Central Asia, 13% are included on the Red List of Threatened Species of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that is IUCN, which constitutes 6.5% of the total numbers of the species included on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species globally. There are a number of issues threatening our planet's biodiversity, from climate change to invasive species. We will discuss them one by one further in this video. Habitat loss and degradation are major causes of species extinction, affecting 89% of all the threatened birds, 83% of mammals, and 91% of all the threatened plants assessed globally. The main causes of habitat degradation are agricultural activities, mining, development of human settlement, industry, etc. Deforestation is a direct cause of extinction and loss of biodiversity. An estimated 18 million acres of forests are lost each year, due in part to logging and other human practices, destroying the ecosystems on which many species depend. Tropical rainforests in particular, such as the Amazon, hold a high percentage of the world's known species, yet the regions themselves are in decline due to humans. Poaching is another threat that has emerged in recent decades as one of the primary reasons for decline in number of species. Wildlife is sold and traded in many countries for live specimens, folk medicines, furs, skins, and other products such as ivory, horns, etc., amounting to millions of dollars. The conflict between man and wildlife started with the evolution of man, but intensity increased due to the activities of modern man. Due to the lack of food and disruption of peace, wild animals came out of the forest area and attacked the agricultural field and humans, and in return got killed by the humans. A changing global climate threatens species and ecosystems. The distribution of species, that is biogeography, is largely determined by climate. Climate change may simply shift these distributions, but for a number of reasons, plants and animals may not be able to adjust. Domino effects occur when the removal of one species, an extinction event, or the addition of one species, an invasion event, affects the entire biological system. Domino effects are especially likely when two or more species are highly interdependent, or when the affected species is a keystone species, meaning that it has strong connections to many other species. Pollution from chemical contaminants certainly pose a further threat to species and ecosystems. From the burning of fossil fuels, releasing dangerous chemicals into the atmosphere and in some cases depleting ozone levels, to dumping 19 billion pounds of plastic into the ocean every year, pollution completely disrupts the Earth's ecosystem. While it may not necessarily cause extinction, pollutants do have the potential to influence species habitat. For example, Acid rain, which is typically caused by the burning of fossil fuels, can acidify smaller bodies of water and soil, negatively affecting the species that live there by changing breeding and feeding habitats. Organisms introduced into habitats where they are not native are termed as exotics. They can be thought of as biological pollutants and are considered to be among the most damaging agents of habitat alteration, ultimately leading to degradation of the world. The introduction of non-native species into an ecosystem can threaten endemic wildlife, either as predators or competing for resources, affect human health, and upset economies. An invasive species is one that arrives, often with human assistance, in a habitat it had not previously occupied, then establishes a population and spreads autonomously. Species invasions are one of the main conservation threats today. Now let's discuss some of the impacts of invasive species. The first impact of invasive species that we will be discussing is ecosystem modification. We can also say that the greatest impact of invasive species are modifying entire ecosystem because such modifications are likely to affect most of the originally resident species. Most obviously, the physical structure of the habitat can be changed. The second impact is resource competition. In Great Britain, the introduced North American gray squirrels forages for nuts more efficiently than the native red squirrel, leading to the decline of the latter species. The third impact of invasive species is aggression. The South American fire ant has been introduced into the southern California. It is very similar in general appearance to native southern fire ant, except the head and thorax of the imported fire ant is a little darker. It attacks other ant species it encounters, and in disturbed areas, this aggression has caused great declines in populations of native ant species. The sting of both species is about the same pain level and leaves a raised, reddish welt, especially in tender areas between the fingers. These ants were accidentally introduced into the US and around the 1930s through the port of Mobile, Alabama, probably in soil used for ships' blast, and have been spreading since. Next comes predation. One of the most dramatic and frequently seen impacts of introduced species is predation on native species. In many instances, native bird species not having evolved adaptations to such predators nested on the ground and were highly susceptible to the invaders. Feral cat threaten the most species overall, that is 430, including 63 that have become extinct. This equates to 1/4 of all birds, mammals, and reptile extinction, making the feral cat arguably the most damaging invasive species for animal biodiversity worldwide. Feral cats are the same species as domestic cats, however, they live and reproduce in the wild and survive by hunting or scavenging. They are found all over Australia in all habitats, including forest, woodland, grassland, wetlands, and arid lands. Herbivory can also be a negative impact of invasive species. Introduced herbivores can devastate the flora of areas lacking similar native species, especially on islands. Goats, introduced to island of St. Helena in 1513, are believed to have eliminated at least half of 100 endemic plant species before botanists had a chance to record them. Next comes pathogens and parasites. Many introduced plant pathogens have modified entire ecosystem by virtually eliminating dominant plants. The geographic range of some ungulate species in Africa is still affected by rinderpest. Because ungulates often play key roles in vegetation structure and dynamic, rinderpest impacts affect entire ecosystem. Now, rinderpest is an infectious disease of ruminants, especially cattle, caused by paramyxovirus. It is characterized by fever, dysentery, and inflammation of the mucous membrane. Next comes hybridization. If introduced species are sufficiently closely related to native species, they may be able to mate and exchange genes with them, and a sufficient amount of genetic exchange can so change the genetic constitution of the native population that we consider the original species to have disappeared, a sort of genetic extinction. This process is especially to be feared when the invading species so outnumbers the natives that a native individual is far more likely to encounter the introduced species than a native species as a prospective mate. Now let's talk about chain reactions. Some impacts of introduced species on natives entail concatenated chains of various interactions. species A affecting species B, then species B affecting species C affecting species D, and so on and so forth. For example, at Washington, US, the chain of interactions triggered by the invasive plant purple loosestrife alters the zooplankton diversity in artificial ponds. Purple loosestrife's many flowers attract pollinators, which attract dragonflies, whose larvae change the diversity of zooplankton in the water. Last but not the least is invasional meltdown. It is a phenomena in which two or more introduced species interact in such a way that the probability of survival and/or impact of at least one of them is enhanced. An example of invasional meltdown occurred in the western United States when livestock such as cattle and sheep were introduced into the region. Grazing and trampling of native grasses by the livestock is thought to have helped to facilitate the invasion of another species, that is cheatgrass. Despite the threats to biodiversity, there are many positive signs that allow the conservationist biologists to be hopeful. For example, the rate of population growth has slowed down. The number of protected areas around the globe continues to increase with the dramatic expansion in the number of marine protected areas. Our ability to protect biological diversity has been strengthened due to a wide range of local, national, and international efforts. Certain endangered species are now recovering as a result of conservation measures. We can point to the expansion of our knowledge base and the science of conservation biology, the developing linkages with rural development and social sciences, and our ability to restore degraded environments.